Welcome to our discussion this morning on the challenges and opportunities of leveraging and maybe some experiences on building open source communities. I'm Truman Esmond, the Vice President of Membership and Solutions at AAIS. I'll be both a moderator of our discussion today, and we'll also be learning not only from our panelists, but from you, our audience, through the magic of the internet's, also an open source solution, by the way, by way of your questions through the form below to any of us here on the panel. Please also feel free to share your own answers to questions that might be posed or perspectives that will help benefit our audience and that we can address today during our session or in follow-up conversations with our membership or with you directly. With that, I'd like to welcome to our panel to our virtual stage. First, Brian Hoffman, Vice President of State and Bureau Regulatory Affairs. He's joined by his colleague, Arron Lamp, Vice President of Emerging Technologies. Both join us from Travelers, now an AAIS member for a whole year now. So happy anniversary. Thanks for joining us today. We're also joined by Brian Behlendorf, the Managing Director for Blockchain, Healthcare, and Identity with the Linux Foundation, perhaps the open source organization and a great addition to our panel today. So thanks for joining us. Today, our panel will be discussing the obstacles and opportunities around leveraging open source technology. There we go. Looks like we got everybody now. Our panel today is Here Is They, and we are participating on a new open source journey ourselves as we bring openIDL into the Linux Foundation. Free software, as I look at over at Brian Behlendorf's face for the cringing. That's how we often hear the words open source, certainly as a young developer or as when buying software in that buying decision. But open source is bigger than that. It's really the pursuit of the path of being able to go further together with that philosophy for broader strategic impact to industries and our industry in particular. But it's not all for the common good. There's opportunity in open source beyond just the free software, as leading and competitive organizations like Travelers are investing time and energy into building the technology and the community around it, and agreeing to do things like this. So your Subway coupons are in the mail. So thank you very much for stepping forward and helping bring our community along with us. So I really look forward to hearing your perspectives, Arron and Brian from Travelers, sharing that experience of what the Travelers journey has been so far. And we have a couple of housekeeping items. Please submit questions through the chat below. We'll try and pick them up during the conversation, and we'll also have some time at the end. Before we get into the weeds and what it looks like from the inside of an emerging open source community effort, I'd like to look to Brian Behlendorf from the Linux Foundation to help us get that stage set and help everybody level set around what is open source software. So Brian Behlendorf, to distinguish between our Brians today. You've been an early author and what we would say a key contributor to Apache, a web server software we all use every day, literally using it right now in delivering this broadcast. Seeing it go from a collaborative effort of individual labors and your own labor of love yourself and the other organizations around it, and then seeing that journey repeated across dozens of projects through the Linux Foundation. Help set the stage for our audience on what is open source, your role and the role of the Linux Foundation in taking a project public, and maybe some of those key ingredients for success on an open source project.
Sure. Well, Truman, you touched the electric third rail of a lot of this conversation when you use the term free software. It's a controversial term because not only is the software zero charge, but it's kind of free as in free beer. It's also a bit of free as in freedom, right? So the ability to modify that, extend it, push it in new directions, and do that with a collective others. But it's also kind of somebody once said it's free as in free puppy. Right, where once you open source a package, that's not the end of a process, that's the beginning of a process where you have to nurture it, you have to care for it, and you're under no obligation to solve everyone else's problems for free once you do that. But you are somewhat under an obligation to, when it goes out there, try to build a community of users that form around it, and then the community, and then the subset of those become contributors, and then the really subset of those become core stakeholders in the initiative. So that's what the Linux Foundation was set up to do. The Linux Foundation got its start about 20 years ago, actually 10 years after the Linux kernel was first published. We're about to hit the 30th anniversary of Linus Torvalds' first version of this kernel. And the Linux Foundation was started at a time when people realized there was a need to pull the stakeholders in this brand new commercial ecosystem together to continue to do the care and feeding of this puppy to help nurture it along, to make sure that it didn't become the exclusive kind of project of one company or another. But also, after time went on, there was this realization that there are all these adjacent technology domains to the operating system that also made sense to try to form these kind of collective groups of organizations around it to help nurture it and help feed it, and also help the companies realize how to build a commercial solution on top, or products and services, how to build a commercial ecosystem really on top of this shared software. So for the last 5 years, I've been leading an initiative at the Linux Foundation called Hyperledger, which has been focused on the open source side of this. And that's one of the underpinning technologies inside of openIDL is Hyperledger Fabric. And now at the Linux Foundation, we are opening a number of projects that are about bringing that open source collaborative energy and style to the formation of these blockchain networks like openIDL.
Thanks, Brian. That's a really great background of, like free isn't necessarily free. And the other thing I go back to being a comic book geek is with great power comes great responsibility. And with open source efforts, we do seek to have a lot of impact. So there is a lot of responsibility across the participants in doing that. So it doesn't come with all those things. So let's talk to our friends here from Travelers and see what this looks like from our industry side, as a user and potential contributor to these sorts of efforts. I'd like to welcome Arron Lamp to our conversation and our first panel together. Thanks, Arron, for joining us today.
Yeah, glad to be here, Truman.
Well, as a leader, and specifically the emerging technologies leader at Travelers, also with background in both, operations and innovation solutions itself, you also spend a lot of time evaluating those emerging technologies and those different applications. So open source probably isn't something new to you as a technology professional or in your role at Travelers. But give us a little background on your experience in your role and help us understand what the enterprise view of open source might look like as an industry veteran. And, where do you see open source, maybe being most applicable to our industry in some of your struggles, or where have you maybe looked to it for solutions?
Oh, definitely. and as you look at emerging technologies, you're looking at a lot of open source. So most of the blockchain platforms out there, are based on open source technologies. A lot of the newer cloud technologies, open source technologies. So as you think about the evolving space or the emerging technology kind of ecosystems, most of those actually are based in open source. I think what Brian said though is kind of apropos. It's like getting a puppy. You get the free puppy, but there are obligations. There's contribution to it. There's growth, development. But I think what you're starting to see is, companies moving to open source are seeing that benefit of having the community and seeing that the software is evolving faster because of folks are embracing open source and leveraging it as a real enterprise capability, going forward. As we think about blockchain, AI, and all the other things that my team, tend to look at, it's a key part of how we're seeing the evolution of these newer capabilities. And bringing those to market in a much different way, So it is a real key part of our future.
Great, thanks. No, those representative, those examples of the different places where we're using open source technology today, even if it's part of a vendor solution that we use as a cloud solution, right? Certainly Amazon and organizations like that aren't open source themselves, but the technology we deploy through those structures, those infrastructures, are often based on open source technology so we can have that choice. So thanks, Arron. So far, so good. One thing that's really important, and I think you just mentioned it as well, is that is the community aspect of open source. What really brings it all together and the purpose of that community. From web servers to operating systems. As we look at the communities today, where we're talking about these real operational communities, not just deploying a software or a technology, but the infrastructure, the operational infrastructure we're looking to deploy, much more, more like the internet as opposed to a particular, software tool or common sort of solution. So as we look to the why of what it is we do, I'd like to look to Arron's colleague, Brian Hoffman, also of Travelers. Seems like yesterday, Brian, but when we found at AAIS found ourselves a kindred spirit in the perpetual struggle for regulatory compliance. When we met Brian in the earliest days of talking about openIDL. So Brian, I'd like to help you to help explain your own experience from accepting that first invitation and then getting to picking up a paddle. And it might have been initially that promise of many fine lunches and dinners at the beginning as we build this, but now that we're virtual and still moving forward, I got to assume there's more to it than that. So as the owner of the business of regulatory reporting and the why we got here, could you give us some perspective on the challenge you had coming in, pre-openIDL, maybe even pre-AAIS? And like Arron, how has this changed the approach? Did was open source new or fit on the path you had in mind?
Sure. So first, Truman, really, thanks for having both Arron and I today. I mean, being able to engage with more folks from the industry is really helpful as we go through this journey. But I think it's interesting that you say we, kind of came together as kindred spirits. So the first time I engaged was, I believe it was December of maybe 18. Boy, it's just so hard to remember. This was all pre-COVID and days that we could actually travel. And I remember heading out to Chicago and Lisle and doing an openIDL design thinking session, and then take it to the last one, which was in February of 2020, which was the last time I actually traveled anywhere. So it's really come full circle. But the amount of progress that we've had since those beginning days is absolutely remarkable. And those design thinking sessions that we had in order to build first build almost a consortium of companies that were engaged in looking for an opportunity to do regulatory reporting maybe in a different way. The interest has been phenomenal, and the engagement with the regulators is almost something to behold. That might sound a little corny, but it really is, because from a company perspective and then from a regulator perspective, the two aspects of that, we provide a ton of data, they get a ton of data, but what happens in between there isn't enough transfer of knowledge or understanding of what the data is, and if the data is even being used. So there are many cases where this data is just being dumped at an insurance department or at the NAIC, and honestly, there are times where it's not used. And that's, first, it's troubling, because as a company, we don't want to just give away data and put it out there and anything could happen to it. So we want to avoid that. And from a regulator perspective, boy, they have just so much time in the day, they have just so much resource, and there's just so much that they can do. So us being able to come together like this and truly change that paradigm of how reporting is done and how it's consumed, and the ability for us now to think about being part of this Linux Foundation, I mean, just the legitimacy, the credibility, the effectiveness that comes from that. And then, beyond just straight regulatory reporting, which is essentially the focus that we have right now, there are so many other opportunities. And not only just from an openIDL perspective, but also thinking about just being a member of the Linux Foundation. I mean, it brings tremendous amounts of new ways, new disruptive technologies even to really engage around things. So we're just, in the midst of it. It's so early in the going here. I mean, if you want to use the baseball analogy, we've got 9 innings usually. We're probably in the first or second inning, and things are continuing to progress. We're looking forward to continuing to engage with even more folks, and especially now with the Linux Foundation, and seeing what we can do.
Thanks, Brian. And that's first, thanks for all your efforts. And I really agree. This is really in the early phases. We're getting some things out of the gate. I apologize for some chiming. I'm actually getting very good news from our collective teammates here with Travelers. So on the background. So, but it is really early phase and where this could go. One of the things I like to encourage when we have conversations like this is, as a technologist, I love learning technologies when the books are really thin. And then it's easy to keep up with it. But as things move pretty quickly, coming in after the first 3 chapters are always written, you got a lot of homework to do to get started. So thanks again, Brian. It was really important to understand the perspective, of getting involved in your evolution and getting to this point, seeing where we are. I also appreciate the speed, the going, slower together for a bigger purpose. I think we're actually beating those expectations on this side, on the insurance side. So that's helpful to get that validation. So we've got a solution that seems to work for insurers, and regulators. They've been at the table, so they know they can get behind it. We've got a 1.0 at this point. As a user, as you said, all the things we want to do, we're not there yet. We haven't built everything that we want yet, or they didn't get into the first release as we have it at this point. Or so as professional software buyers, we know that there's cost beyond our control. Over to Brian Behlendorf. If there's no bill, how do we, and we're not, and if privacy is part of the goal, that assumes that we're not the product, like not the free software we get every day as humans. What's the mechanism in open source to help make sure this stays on the rails, make sure that it's evolving correctly, where we want it to go as a community stays relevant, and the how committed is it to free? I mean, is there a catch? And what's the catch, right? I guess.
Yeah. Well, back to the free puppy analogy, right? When you receive free software, when you receive open source software and you deploy it in your enterprise, you're suddenly under an obligation to make sure that works well. And sometimes you're going to want to have another throat to choke, so to speak. So you'll pay a service provider or a vendor to provide you, kind of paid support for that, right? That still means it's still open source software, but you finally have somebody you can appeal to, you have an SLA with, that sort of thing. And we see, for example, in the blockchain space, quite a few of these blockchain infrastructure providers offering Hyperledger Fabric as a managed service, so you can pay them, a certain amount per month, and you get a certain number of nodes, and that all works. But so there's kind of a direct compensation model, which is true for a lot of how open source works. There's obviously also the indirect value that one receives by using this software, right? We believe if you look at any software stack, probably 80% of the software inside that stack or inside that product, be it a car or a children's toy or a phone, certainly, is pre-existing open source code that you're benefiting from if you're the company behind that product or that technology. So in deploying it and building a business on it, now there's an incentive to make sure that underlying stack is healthy. Even though you're not paying somebody a licensing fee for it, your future still depends upon it, right? So in this scenario, we're not suddenly expecting every insurance company to become, a Red Hat style company, right? There are some that no doubt will have their technology teams dive into the code, dive into the openIDL code, which implements this harmonized data store concept, which builds on top of Fabric and MongoDB and others. I certainly expect them to understand how that works, maybe even add a feature, certainly to fix bugs, contribute it upstream. There'll be other insurance companies and other participants in the ecosystem who will use the software and build value on top and probably never even contribute a bug fix. And that's fine, because it's kind of like, in a way, it's like the Wikipedia, right? Not everybody reading the Wikipedia has to contribute back to it, just enough people. And I think what we've shown in openIDL is you can get that critical mass going of users and core participants and really generate that value that way. And then in the long term, there's this governance picture, and that's the role for the Linux Foundation. And the openIDL project is sustained by membership. AAIS is a big partner with that. Thank you for that. But for a small amount of money per company, we bring you in as members. We use that as a way to shepherd the community through kind of the growth and the different tooling that's required to make an open source community work. And as we're stepping into this blockchain network governance role, being a member of that project will be required to stand up a node on the network. So all of that is the core part of the sustainability model, and it's about how do we do the smallest amount at the center of that to enable a lot of the heavy lift, but also the value capture to happen on the periphery by the participants in the network.
Exactly. Thanks. Right. So there's certainly a bit to do in the governance of those rules, particularly as we're building operational solutions, be it that part of that infrastructure or something that is not software, but an operational solution that makes sure that we are accountable as a community. Certainly, insurers and regulators are part of the community of insurance, but certainly have different objectives, and that governance structure is the sustainability and how we're able to corral these efforts of all the different players to keep that in there, and transparency. Getting back to open source and how that's done relative to a vendor solution is really the key. When we have that transparency and we have the participation of some of these other stakeholders who we often refer to as problems, not part of the solution, but they're necessary. We're not going to be able to innovate our way out of regulation, in insurance industry anytime soon. Arron, I'd like you to maybe if you could dig into what you see beyond this initial release. I don't think regulatory reporting was the thing you were seeking to innovate, in all of the hundreds of use cases that have been discussed, certainly, within the blockchain, and those emerging technologies. Can you discuss how maybe this initiative fits in, differentiates it, and maybe characteristics, in the open source community, Linux Foundation open source versus, what I say kind of marketing level open source? Is that something different, those of us not in the technical community?
Yeah, definitely, Truman. And I want to take one step back where Brian was at is, I think adding bug fixes, contributing to the code. There are communities who are going to do that and get very much ingrained in that. But I think in the space we're in, it's also bringing that knowledge of the environment, knowledge of the requirements. There's a huge opportunity here for us to learn from each other about putting together a platform that is growing, developing, kind of the product side of the platform, if you think of it that way. That we're continually kind of thinking about what next and how to do it and how a better way to do it. And I think the collective wisdom of folks like Brian and others coming into that is one of the real advantages, is that we're contributing to a singular platform. We're adding the best and brightest into that. And as we do so, the platform is going to get better. And again, regardless who does the code, that's going to get better. I think a couple of things with this, though, is as you look at the platform, there's a real big piece for us, at least, and I think from every carrier, and I think everybody who's involved is the the blockchain does drive a privacy aspect of this. It is that idea of we're putting it in our node, and you said it's like every carrier is going to have a node. They're going to join to have a node. Well, the node is ensuring that privacy. It's ensuring that data control, so that as we get challenged, and again, we're all watching the news, we're all seeing all the regulations and all the things happening to a variety of industries. This is really setting a stage around that is starting to put us in a place where we haven't been before. It's a lot of controls in place of current process, but future process looks very, very different. And I think that future process is a big thing we were most excited about, is the blockchain sets up a wealth of data, but in a very controlled manner. It allows us to make sure we secure it, fulfill our fiduciary responsibility to our policyholders and claimants and other folks like that who are very much counting us to do that. But then put the right kinds of access in place. Brian Hoffman mentioned we submit a lot of data and sometimes it doesn't seem like it gets used. Well, the idea of the smart contract, tying into the nodes and the blockchain data set here, really enable that usage. But it's not every state trying to figure that out. Every state doesn't need to build a smart contract. A lot of states are going to be able to just use the smart contracts that are in the environment, that they can repurpose, they can think about, they can and reuse these kind of things. And I think that collective community of states and companies all working together, trying to build the right kind of environment, it is actually what's going to drive the innovation. And innovation takes many, many forms. It's the get the regulatory reporting done. It's starting to think about how we do data calls and support CAD events and other type of things like that. And then start doing kind of innovative analytics, putting things like AI in the platform to start understanding the data in a different way, but in a very secure way, so we don't have to worry about the ramifications of this. We can control those and make sure we're really buying into it on the front end, so we don't have those back end issues. I think, Truman, that's kind of at least the big topics we saw as key for us.
Thanks, Arron. That's really helpful, and I certainly agree with all of those points. And really the key things is making sure we establish the priorities of the different members of our community, of the problem that we're trying to solve, or the stakeholders in that problem. And as you mentioned, as a data owner, privacy and control of your enterprise resources, in which data is ever more important, is really the key. And being able to do that in an objective way, requires collaboration and bringing people that we ordinarily try and keep at arm's length sometimes, be they competitors or regulators. We need to bring them to the table in order to make sure we've got an environment that we can, take into the second gear. So back to Brian Hoffman again. So that brings us back to why it is we're doing what we're doing, and why stat reporting, wasn't necessarily the thing that we did, but this is, being in regulatory and bureau reporting, you see the data stream and the context that we're talking about in a very specific perspective. Without revealing any specific traveler secrets of how you're going to take over the world, would you mind explaining how joining an open source project, for a colleague, the case for a for-profit organization getting involved, and maybe even the big piece that's different for open source, convince your competitor to join?
Sure. I thought we already did take over the world, so I'll have to go back later and figure that out. But
keep it taken over, right? It keeps getting broken.
So when we look at this, going back to some of Arron's comments, and this is going to be a key. I mean, you can see the engagement that Arron has around this. So think about this. So statistical reporting, boy, that is not the shiny object in the room. That is not what folks at the senior level of the company are walking around talking about all day, or thinking, how are we going to do more statistical reporting? How are we going to do it differently? They don't think about it. This stuff is more back room than a lot of the things that we do every day. And so that's where you have to kind of shine the light. And we think about it as there are a couple of paths that you can that we see the data flowing. One, it's essentially a commodity. For the regulators to get this, every company has to do this. Everybody has to have a stat agent. Everybody has to have their data reported. So there's that commodity piece where it just has to flow to the regulator. To Arron's point, smart contracts go on top of it. They get to choose the pieces that they are approved to be able to look at. That's all done. But then there's the back piece that Arron was touching on too. And that's where each company gets to do their own secret sauce. Like Arron said, put some AI on top of it, the data and analytics that you're going to run. That's where it really takes it to a different level. Because if we're doing this correctly, we can have some very anonymized and simple ways to do some comparisons across industry with regulators or us. So there's different options out there that are available. So very exciting to have that opportunity. But so let's get back to, okay, how do we make this happen? How did we make it happen? First of all, don't think it's going to go fast, because it's not. I mean, this is millions of records of data that are going to be leaving the building potentially in a different way. And so you need people to be comfortable with that. So that takes a lot of informing. I have a tremendous partner in Arron that has helped, beyond what we ever could have imagined to get these connections that we needed. We needed to be at, basically the highest level in the organization that you can get, I would recommend. You just need to be there. You need to help folks understand that this is going to be an effective and an efficient way of moving data in and out of the building, and the different ways then that you as an individual company and as an individual regulator get to utilize the data for. The smart contracts are critical here, and that's a big selling point, so that the companies can get comfortable that we're going to provide data in this manner. Folks can hear open source and they start worrying. You've got an Android phone and sometimes it doesn't work great. Whereas you have an Apple product and it might work a little bit better. I'm not taking sides. I'm just saying, there are certain biases potentially out there that you just have to overcome. And they're easy enough to overcome. And I say that especially because the team that's building this with AAIS and now with Linux, these folks will be on the phone anytime, any day. It doesn't matter. And back when we used to travel, remember those days? They would come out and sit with anybody at any time to help folks understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And so as we went through that process, we made sure we were engaged with legal folks, compliance folks, finance folks, actuarial, you name it, claim folks. Everybody really needs to be at the table. And don't forget your statutory reporting folks, because those are the ones that are really, they're in charge of the books. And we at a certain point in the year, you have to do that validation to make sure the statistical and the statutory line up. Got to make sure that those folks are at the table. So the more people you have at the table and the higher in the organization you can get, I think you're going to be finding yourself, really getting those partners that you need in order to really move the process through your company and begin this process.
Thanks, Brian. That was really perfect, and you really said really the key. It's not about it's getting everybody involved, but also understanding, certainly when we're talking about data, what the real source of truth is with respect to the community question. They have the books for the purposes of communicating with regulators in the broader industry, not for necessarily paying claims. But maybe that's the same data as we move forward.
Right.
So as it's more accessible for a variety of different purposes, multiple versions of the truth can be the same facts. So looking back at the implementation of this, and what's the difference as you look to actually implement an open source project and participate in one from the ground up, particularly if it's new to their enterprise. And Arron, leading the technical operations, certainly over the last year plus, where we've actually been doing the implementations, if you will, and tearing things apart and putting things back together. But as we go into this next phase, what does it look like, and the things that you might need to do as an enterprise to prepare to, or just simply to participate on that side of the initiative? Was there a lot of change required to your organization to get there?
It is all change, and I think we're underselling if we don't acknowledge that working this way is different than what we've done in the past. We're all very familiar with data flows out of our production systems, our RQIs, where we issue policies. We do things like ETL it. We put it in a warehouse. We extract that and do another ETL. And then we get it to Brian, and Brian has to figure out a way to get it to the state. And that process is very ingrained in most things we do, quite honestly. As we think about this and say, well, no, we need to get it into a format. We're going to load it up into the blockchain and streamline a whole lot of that approach. It is changing how we think about this stuff. It is changing, as Brian's saying, taking a lot of data out of the building, but doing it in a way that's different than we've done in the past. That we're loading to a cloud landing zone, we're pulling it into a blockchain. And by the way, that's our node. It's still our property. It's ours. But thinking about that differently, and how to approach it, and explain that to folks who have been working in an older way of doing this into kind of a newer way of doing this. Not that we're not doing this elsewhere, but obviously in this space, this is a space that hasn't received a lot of this kind of attention in the past. So that's a big change. And again, as we start thinking about the care and feeding and maintaining of this going forward, we're partnering. We're partnering with AAIS, openIDL, Linux Foundation. We're partnering with a community of folks now to maintain something where we've thought of it in the past as something we do. We do it, we get it to a state, check mark, we're done. Now we're thinking of this more as, okay, the collective group is now going to be, in network. Everyone has their nodes. We're all connecting. And as we think of changes, think about new development, think about evolution of the capabilities, it's starting to think differently. And again, that's not just outside, that's inside. And how can we make that better, simpler, and faster, is part of how we're kind of trying to contemplate that, which is any company who's working in a emerging tech space, who's thinking about different ways of doing stuff, who's using cloud technologies, they're on this journey. And I think what this did is really kind of leapfrogged, the stat reporting, the regulatory reporting, and a lot of those kind of things, which tend to be the last things we do. They kind of put it at the front of the bus. So it's very exciting that way to see that kind of that leapfrog aspect of this, and allow those areas now to kind of leading in some of these newer capabilities. So I think that's kind of the gist what we're seeing, but it is a journey, and we're still on it. So we're looking forward to the next steps here.
Thanks, Arron. And what really struck me as you were talking about that was the shift in putting the purpose first, as opposed to what we did, and certainly what I did when I joined AAIS was a data accumulation strategy, right? Get more data, get it all in there, build systems to hold it and store it. But we go back to our question of privacy and control, as well as transparency and accountability. Do you really want to be accountable for all that data? Do you want to be responsible for that? That's a lot to protect. That's a lot to store. And as we saw it in AAIS, what that ran into is we became part of the problem, not a path to the solution. We had to, again, going back to open source. So, you gotta let it go in order for it to truly flower and get to that power, we think. So thanks, Arron. That's great. And certainly from Arron and Brian, we've seen how we're all committed as a team to get this done. We're able to, excited to see these visions start to become reality, and all these rainbows and unicorns to start to go on a parade. Brian Behlendorf, having been around this block once or twice, having seen a parade or two and maybe seen a few get canceled, what do we need to do to be ready for, the next challenge, the next step? What do we have to be vigilant about to not just get it out of the gate, but keep it going? And is, do you have examples of good or bad ends, or is it truly just the journey that we are enjoying to be on?
Well, I think under promising and over delivering is one of the key things to launching an initiative like this. Being humble out of the gate, not saying we're going to solve everyone's problem overnight, especially since so much of the last mile of getting this deployed and integrated into back offices and that sort of things depends upon having leadership like you do there. So starting it from a point of view of saying let's put the code out, let's see what community develops around it, and being a little bit kind of starting with small steps towards getting something launched and in production is really key here. It also is important to transition conversations that happen in closed meetings or happen between two people on a Zoom call or happen in private emails to something that's more public facing is absolutely essential to making open source processes work, to being able to recruit a larger pool of developers and contributors, and also to build trust in the public. But it also can be a real mental frame shift in terms of how a lot of people think software is written, or a lot of how historically perhaps even the code we're starting with has been written. So that's an important transition to go through. It's something that we always, when we launch projects, we spend a huge amount of time working with the initial founding cohort of those projects to understand how to transform their development processes into something public facing. And then finally, so often as developers, you're really focused on meeting your own set of needs, meeting your employer's set of needs, getting something just over the hump to getting something launched, even if it meant some rickety shell scripts here or there, or kind of a bootstrap that might not be pretty. And that's if you do just that and you don't think about the ladder that a new user has to climb in order to get to a running system, get to something the equivalent of a hello world, then it's going to be really hard for anybody new to climb that without becoming a tremendous support burden. And so one of the first things I think for us to think about is, how do we improve the documentation? How do we improve the out-of-the-box experience with this code? How do we provide that staircase, if you will, so that people can go from hearing about this to trying it out to actually running something demonstrable in value, to being able to connect to the blockchain network we're setting up and now becoming a stakeholder, with no step being kind of like too onerous or something that pushes people away. It needs to be additive there. So all of those come to mind when thinking about launching an open source project like this as challenges, but things that we've identified and will continue to need to work through and resource.
Thanks, Brian. So I'd like to remind the audience, certainly please submit any questions if you have. We'll make sure to hit those as we get into towards the home stretch here. Want to add another question to our conversation, and actually a couple, where we hear about some of the challenges that we have to progress in our industry, in a couple of different things. First, Brian Hoffman, I'd like to start with you. We touched on a little bit earlier that regulators are the problem, but at the same time looking for them to pick up and cover, help us as an industry in places where we can't go. And certainly over the last couple of years, we've seen a much different relationship, certainly than what we might, say in public, if you will. Is there something that we can do to help facilitate that dynamic within our own organizations, to help change that relationship with regulators so that we can get to a better solution that we want, and things that we can do, that you can do, that you might do inside Travelers, not that you are doing necessarily, but
yeah. So I think the first thing, Truman, is I just think that's a false narrative. I think the relationships that we have as an industry with regulators are pretty darn solid, and I think they're all going in the same direction. Do we agree on everything? There's no way, and we never will, and we shouldn't, because that's just the way. It's almost like a marketplace. That's the way it should be. You should have an industry, and you should have a regulator, and potentially going in different aspects of a direction, but the direction is still the same. You still are trying to protect customers and provide this thing that we call insurance, which is probably the most important thing in the economy today. So I think it is a bit of a false narrative. That said, what we need to do is we absolutely need to engage. And I think the best part there's some of the best parts that I've seen with AAIS and openIDL is that true engagement. And this is from individual states to the NAIC. And it's critical to do it that way, because so much of the, say technology and innovation committees, all the different committees at the NAIC level, they're all made up of the individual regulators. But there's also that NAIC infrastructure that looks for data as well. For instance, the business interruption data call for COVID, that's run through the NAIC. And, if we're not there and engaged with the folks at the NAIC, we're not going to be able to, participate. And fortunately, I think Truman, you guys did an amazing job to get connected into NAIC and to be ready and in position when COVID struck, to be able to be a parallel response to the traditional way to provide the data for COVID. So I think that's great. I think we need to continue to do that. We need to find different use cases for the states to understand so that they can continue to see the benefit. But I'll tell you, we've engaged with the top regulators across the country, and to an individual, they are excited about this. They are looking forward to it, because they agree that there's data that comes in that they're not quite sure is even in their department. So by utilizing the blockchain and having smart contracts and having the right people involved, they'll know how to get to their data so that they can serve their constituents better than they do today. And that's from a legislative perspective to the individual consumers. So that's going to be a huge positive. And as we continue to engage at every state, I mentioned North Dakota. And as an aside, so the North Dakota Insurance Commissioner, he is the tallest elected politician in the world. You can look it up. He's a very tall man, but he is a very nice man and extremely engaged. You think North Dakota, and you might not think of the Silicon Valley types. Listen, North Dakota is really on top of this stuff. And so that's what makes it so interesting, is you can find these, as back to Truman's word, the kindred spirits are out and about everywhere. And we just need to continue to connect with them. And we're going to find ourselves in a really good place.
Thanks, Brian. And that's, great. I agree completely. It is a false narrative, because that's not been my experience. Once we understand and empathize, with regulators and what is they're trying to do. And, and we laughed, it's all about common sense. The problem is it may not be your common sense, right? We have to do the work to figure out what that common sense is, because we have different goals, motives, visions of what the ideal looks like. And I want to bring it back to the technology, and Arron, on the same side, one of the things that are limiting factors as we look at innovation, if we can solve the regulatory problem, is the problem of privacy, data privacy. We talk about control, and we can secure everything and build the great walls, but being able to manage our privacy. And Brian, you mentioned the North Dakota, and one of the POCs we're looking at there around uninsured motorists. How is the ability to better leverage increasingly private data that is both timely, specific, what we would call PII in today's world, which is often, a third rail. If we could solve that problem, what could we do? What kind of solutions could we have? And what kinds of places would free up on our ability to leverage other types of technologies and overcome this technical hurdle that really prevents us, again, from acknowledging objective facts as it relates to our purposes.
Yeah, I think, I would say that, the data has always been, acknowledged as private. The concerns of care, taking care of it, stewardship of it, we all know. But the way we've done that in the past is we erected very big walls and try to hold it in as much as we possibly could. And again, that was a strategy, and it worked very well for a lot of companies. What you're seeing, though, is the world's all about the data. And if you step back and see all the things we're trying to do, the regulators, us, everybody in the middle, it is all about the data and how we can, share, how we can use, how we can build on the data is the discussion we're really trying to have here. I think as we think about the privacy aspects of this and pull it together, the fact we're using blockchain, we're getting increasingly comfortable. I mean, the amount of cryptocurrency trading and news out there is quite extraordinary these days, and it's all the same basic technology. You're using a distributed ledger technology to secure this. We're using access controls through smart contracts that are permissioned. that say Brian has to say yes. I mean, that's my control point is Brian has to say yes. If he does, we're good. If he doesn't, we're not. But it's to a very specific usage, and that's what's starting to take down the walls. Is I don't need to give you, the entire treasure trove of data of travelers for you to answer a question. You can ask a very specific question about a very specific set of policies, and this allows that to be fulfilled without a whole lot of things in the middle. And I think the way we're thinking about the technology and moving forward, and applaud the team there. Obviously, Truman, you guys have done a lot of work of putting a really nice architecture that is working very well. But the extensibility, that's quite amazing as well. As you start thinking of things like, identity as a thing of which we're going to be spending more time on. So it's not just did you protect my address? Did you protect my name? There's a lot of work out there, and it's relating very strongly into the blockchain space, which says we can actually even do more as we are able to secure identities more in this environment. In doing so, that does open up a lot more anonymization, a lot more ability to run more and more kinds of workloads against it, to understand more about the data itself and have it start answering questions which we probably didn't know the question to ask. Those are the kind of things that get kind of exciting in this space. And I think it all starts with focus on the data, make sure we've implemented the kinds of technologies we are implementing. And that really starts enabling this whole set of future capabilities that we think of that, it's a win-win-win for all the parties.
Fantastic. That's perfect, actually. Thank you. So we're getting to about 10 minutes left in our time this morning, and actually I just, before we get to my wrap-up question, I just want to invite Brian Behlendorf to kind of speak to that and talk to some of the, being the director of blockchain identity and healthcare. Are there some things, maybe some natural next steps we might consider integrating? Maybe.
Good question. Actually, at the Linux Foundation, we recently, over the last couple of years, have stepped into recognizing that these technical processes around the development of software also lend themselves to the development of reusable specifications. So not quite to make us a standards body like ISO or anybody like that, ISO being a different thing than the insurance industry ISO, to be clear, or IEEE, but to start to say maybe the specifications around software themselves and the IP issues around that require some special focus. And now stepping into this governance networks piece, which is really about building these cooperative, call it data sharing if you'd like, because you are converging on a common system of record amongst a group of organizations. And some of that system of record will contain sensitive information. Some of it will allow for you to reverse engineer how well a business is doing, and maybe that's bankable, that sort of thing. All of these are incredibly valuable and intense concerns, and that's why the blockchain space has been focusing quite a bit on technologies like zero-knowledge proofs and side trees and other approaches to being able to keep private data private, but be able to perform operations against it. And do that in a way that is more decentralized and trustless than perhaps historically has been done. And all of that is really encouraging. In fact, it's leading to certain fields that were a surprise to me when I stepped into the LF and Hyperledger, such as digital identity, potentially being completely remade by this technology. Instead of going from all your data sits at the other end of a name and password on a portal somewhere, think your, health insurance portal or your, HR system, or things that sit at Facebook or Twitter, instead of things being remote there, holding that in a wallet, holding that in a way that's independent, and being able to share that with the person of your choice, and being able to keep track of who you shared it with and limit them from sharing it onward. All of that is now much more technically possible than it's ever been before, and aligns very nicely with where privacy regulations are going here in the States, like in California, in Virginia, and other states that are starting to deploy it, as well as the GDPR in Europe and that sort of thing. So we at the Linux Foundation realize that data sharing is really another reflection of this kind of open technology movement, that open source software happened to plant a very strong flag in over the last 25 years, but is part of a continuum. And so we're spending a lot of time thinking about how can we be helpful in the development of these data sharing networks like openIDL.
Great, thanks, Ryan. That's it's really great, and we're really excited to join to be joining the Linux Foundation and to be deploying it in these broader use cases, and where that interoperability and privacy, that accountability, timeliness, context, efficiency from a technical perspective, all these things can like you said, we have the capability now. It's just a question about how we want to apply it, right? We can do flying cars now if we and insurance is a requirement to do that. So yeah, we got a little less than 10 minutes left. I know we started a couple of minutes earlier as we were troubleshooting Wi-Fi. But I want to make sure we get those final nuggets from our panel, particularly as we're speaking a lot to insurers. Brian and Arron, if you could close with a couple of your own final words coming from leaders of a founding organization from both the business and the technology and innovation perspective. And again, kind of the necessities or characteristics of your highly effective duo. What might you tell your colleagues with similar responsibilities? And Arron, I'll start with you first, being the new one to our panel, and alphabetically.
Yeah, no, definitely. A couple things. One is that is the partnership. It's not the business and the technology. It's the business and the technology. Is the way I would suggest to do this. Brian and I are back and forth like all the time on what about this, what about that, how's it going to affect us, what should we be thinking about? We've done joint calls with some regulators on a very informal basis just to have a chat about what are the opportunities. And it's really great to be able to have like Brian speaking to specifically, these are the kinds of things we've done with you recently or in the past. And then I can add to that and saying, okay, this is how that might look differently going forward. And that tag team of business and technology right there together is, it's a very agile kind of thing, which everyone's trying to do these days. But I would say, truly marrying it up to where it's, we're both working together to get to an objective. And I think that's the big piece for us, is focusing on the real objective, partnering very deeply in doing that, and breaking down all the silos along the way is going to be really key.
Thanks, Arron. Brian Hoffman, follow up on that?
Sure. There's really nothing else to really add to that. I'll just emphasize technology and business has to be tied together. It's critical. So everything Arron said is just spot on. So I will take just a little bit of a minute here just to speak to the winter storms in Texas. So, all of our thoughts go to the folks down there that are still recovering and getting power back and trying to get back to normal. But immediately, just like all states will do, the Texas Insurance Department of Insurance they're looking for some data. They want to understand exposures, losses, everything. And if there was a blockchain consistently across the industry that most were participating on, they could have their data in hours. And they're looking at a date of like mid-March. So the power here is remarkable. It's going to happen. And I just encourage folks to, if anybody's got questions, reach out to us. We're glad to talk about it. We're not going to disclose any kind of proprietary stuff, and we're going to stay within antitrust concerns. But there's a great power here, and I think the states that experience the disasters are going to benefit significantly from this.
Yeah, thanks. I agree, Brian. And Brian Behlendorf, your earlier comment about one of the things that's really important is humility. Hearing sessions like these is really difficult for me to remain so. My wife is definitely tired of hearing me say, what'll fix that every time we see a problem come across the TV. But so I guess with our last couple of minutes, the big part of this is to bring people into our open source community and help people, encourage people to learn a little bit, grab an oar and paddle. So I guess Brian Behlendorf, I'd turn you to the last word of what folks can do, where we are, and how they can get involved.
Well, we're still in the formation stages of the project, but we've got a lot of nice moving parts to it. There's the public website at AAISonline.com/openIDL, and we're creating some new resources around that. But please get in touch with Truman, myself, or come to that website and click through to info@openidl.com, I believe is also a path to come in. Really interested in talking to anybody who wants to know more about this, wants to learn how to get involved, and happy to direct you to further resources.
Great, thanks very much. We'll certainly share those links, and as you mentioned, hit AAISonline.com and of course linuxfoundation.org to learn more. That about does it for our time today. Hopefully we were able to help you see some of the unique challenges and opportunities of building and participating in these early formation stages, as well as leveraging those open source and community-driven solutions like openIDL that's getting ready to take off. So thank you to our audience for your time, participation. Thank you to our panelists for a terrific session and each of you sharing your unique insights. And
Glad to
if
be
you'd like,
here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Truman.
Thank
if
you.
you'd like to discuss more open source platforms, as I said, please reach out to either of us at AAIS, openIDL. And if you want to learn about anything else we hit on today, please reach out. Thanks again. And with that, Ed, I'll hand it back to you.